So I know retopology is kind of like a subject that we don't like to talk about because it's tedious, it's time consuming, and it's generally not the most fun thing in the world, but it is a reality of the job. So I thought we'd take a walk through the topology pan in Modo. We've talked about it before in terms of creating geometry, but I wanted to talk about it in terms of how to attack a mesh that was particularly gnarly. And by gnarly, I mean a mesh that's been, say, came from a CAD program or came from the example I'm going to give you, which is like me in ZBrush throwing a bunch of booleans at something and a bunch of curves and then saying, here, 3D artist, go ahead and make a low poly of this. That's what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you some strategies for that. I'll give you some things to think about during that process. And yeah, we'll have some topo fun. So for reference, this is the shape we're going to be dealing with today. Lots of curvy bits, lots of subtracted holes out of it and that kind of thing. Just kind of a topology nightmare that's not simply a matter of throwing a box around and, chamfering some edges and getting the low poly we want. This is more of a beast. Now obviously with topology, there's a lot of options these days. You can, we could hit it with Z-remesher. We could decimate it. We could, if this was a proper sub-D mesh, we could just remove edge loops and that kind of thing. But sometimes you don't have that option. So we're going to send this over to Modo and we're going to look at doing it manually. So as advertised, here we are in Modo and our shape came over nicely. So retopology strategies. When it comes to doing manual retopology, I typically will use the topology view. I know there are some people who don't like it, but yeah, I find it useful. So to get started, I will have my high poly mesh here. I'm in a new mesh item. And for the initial launch, I will just create a quad hanging out in space. And I got my topology pen on a pie menu that I can select it quickly because I use it for lots of stuff, but it's over, here on your UI and all that kind of jazz. Anyway, so picking the topology pen, you also need to make sure that your background constraint is turned on and all that kind of stuff. But once you've got that set up correctly, once you drag stuff around, Modo will snap that geometry to the background meshes, which makes retopo pretty darn painless, to be perfectly honest with you. So if I have this, I can begin to lay in my geometry. But how do I lay in that geometry and why do I lay in that geometry? So with a shape like this, you need to start to consider how you want your geometry to flow. Not because it needs to deform, but because it can actually help you with the retopo work. So let's take a look at that. The strategy that I will usually follow is one of defining all of my major edges and holes first and fill in the rest later. So it's kind of like we're defining the dimensions and leaving the body for later. You'll see. You'll see. So using my topology pen, I will drag around here and just define these major edges. Using enough geometry that I feel that I'm capturing the curve correctly, but not so much that it's just going to be another high poly mesh. It's very much a judgment call when it comes to this stuff, and it takes a little bit of experience to know how much geo is going to be enough and that kind of thing. But I will typically try to maintain consistent geo across the shape because you can always go through an optimization phase later. Right? You go back and you're like, okay, I put all this geo in, but I don't actually need all this geo. So you can start to tear it out. Now, one trick with the topology pen, or not a trick, I guess more of a tip, I would say, is if you can. So let's say I do this, right? I drag out this geo and I want to put this vertex on this edge right here because that's where it belongs. So in this view here, if I drag the vertex, it's sticking to the background mesh. But if I go over here, now it's snapping to all that geo back there. So if you are This doesn't always work, but if you're fortunate enough to be able to turn the mesh like this so you can't see past the edge, Modo won't let you drag off the mesh. You see how that's sliding along the visual edge right there? That can really help you to position your geometry correctly. As you see up here, when I was manually eyeballing this, some of that's not exactly where it should be. So I can then use that visual horizon point, or whatever you want to call it, that visual cutoff up there to clip, well, to properly snap the verts into place. It's extremely useful. And if you do it properly, you angle yourself so you can just see that edge. You can drag along and kind of slide stuff into place pretty rapidly. And just keep turning, keep fussing, keep adjusting. Honestly, that's kind of the strategy for all retopo work. Keep dragging, keep fussing, keep twitching, and eventually you'll get to the end of it. So I'm going to do a little more work here. I'm going to fill out the outer edge, and I'll be right back. And so as I'm working along here, I had a thought. When you're laying in your geo, the reason that I follow these major edges is because it's a lot the same reason as when you see people, when you follow like a tutorial for a car or something. They will almost always tell you to model in such a way that you're following the curvature of the car. And part of that reason is, well, number one, because it makes sense. But number two, because it helps the low poly to react correctly to to lighting and such. It's easier to hit the correct specular highlights, when your mesh has the geo in the right spots. So that's really the major reason why I advocate that kind of a retopo strategy. And I'm doing the same thing with the cutout circle. I'm just, where the edges meet, we have a little bit of a situation happening there, but that's fine. It's not a bad situation, it's just a situation. I round out the outer edges of the holes first, again, using enough geo to make sure that it will look right. I think it gets back to the definition of what a low poly mesh is these days. So a low poly mesh these days is definitely not what it used to be. Low poly these days kind of means you're kind of getting into the medium poly range to be, to be real about it. I mean, low poly means as low as it needs to be to maintain the silhouette. So on something like this, we need more geometry because there's quite a bit of curvature. But on something flat, it depends how hard you want to leverage your normal map, but you can get away with a pretty low poly mesh. But my larger point there is that, low poly these days, it doesn't mean, it used to be kind of this like personal challenge thing. Like artists would try to get like as low as they possibly could. Like, I've done an entire tank in 75 polygons and that kind of thing. And that's, that hasn't been the case in quite a long time, to be honest. But especially with modern hardware and just how much faster everything's getting, how much more powerful everything's getting, it's just not worth going that low. Which is great for artists because, we don't have to stress out so hard about the topology. And it gets you more into that zone of just being able to produce props quickly and have good looking results and not have to waste a lot of time on optimization. Some optimization is obviously necessary still, don't get carried away, but you have a lot more freedom these days, that's all I'm saying. So as you begin to finish up your edging of all of your contours, you will begin to run into situations like this where you're starting to get near other geometry, and it's time to start thinking about how to stitch things up. And I'm honestly not that careful with this sort of thing. I mean, I don't mind if there's triangles touching and that kind of stuff, because it doesn't really affect things in the end. As long as the mesh will smooth correctly, it's fine. See, where are we at here? We got just about everything done. So in case you're not familiar with Moto's Topology pen, it offers a couple of cool ways to create geometry. If I shift drag on an edge, that pulls out a polygon. If I shift drag on a vertex, that also drags out a polygon. Well, a quad, I should say. But now I'm pulling the opposite vert around, and I can snap that in place. Those two are the meat and potatoes of getting your retopo work done. And I just shift drag, shift drag, shift drag all the way around. There's functionality where you can shift drag entire edge loops and they all pull down, but I find well, here, I'll show you. If I shift drag on this edge here, it pulls the whole edge down and extends it, but I don't actually find that all that useful, because usually the loop is too long and the verts at the end, they end up moving weird and that kind of stuff, or they snap to the wrong thing, and I have to straighten all the edges out anyway. So in the end, it didn't really save me any time, but I appreciate the thought. I see where they were going. One other cool thing it does is if you drag from an open edge to another open edge, they snap together nicely and just weld up. So that helps a lot with getting shapes finished up. And when you're close enough, you get that satisfying little, ching, you just jam the edges together, which is fun for me anyway. This edge here actually looks like it's not needed for anything, so that was a little excessive. Just delete that and carry on. That one got a little grouchy, so do that. Okay. So if I go into solo mode, I can see my actual shape, and I see I've got the contour essentially defined. I did some filling in over here too, because why not? Yeah, so we're getting ready to do the fill-in phase, which is pretty rapid. That's just a matter of you need to fill up the inner space with polygons. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. I generally will do it manually still, just because I like doing it manually. But you could grab the entire, like here, I'll do this kind of thing. I will drag out polys as far as makes sense. You're making sure that we're following the basic contours, but as that kind of thing widens up, I'm going to have to split it. So we'll have a quad running this way, a quad running this way, and we will let those kind of diverge on their own. And you just have a triangle living here that I'll stitch up later, and then he becomes his own quad row inside the other two. That sort of thing. Just use your best judgment as to how to lay this out. Make sure you have enough geo on there to capture the shape. So I'm going to finish this up for real this time, and I'll be back. And so finally we arrive with the retopo work done. The shape is defined, and this 646 triangles is a lot less than the 412,000 we started with. Now, obviously, you know the drill from here. You can UV this and bake a normal map. And actually, hold on for a second. Okay, so just for demonstration purposes, I UV'd the mesh, I set all the smoothing up, and baked out a normal map. So you can see that we've got all of our edges captured. We still have our same low poly mesh. Everything's looking good. This circle might need a few more segments, but that's what the iteration process is for. But the basic stuff I wanted to show seems to be successful. So good. So I guess that's it. There's not much more to say about that. I hope you found that useful. Next video, we're going to start looking at some workflow improvements that I've come across lately. Watching Tor Frick and reading some stuff and trying some things. I have some ideas. See you next time.